The committee to order. Good morning, everyone. We are gathered this morning to hear from the Secretary of Defense, Dr. Mark Esper, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, to hear about the President's FY21 budget proposal for the Department of Defense. And I will start with some good news. Well, first of all, I'll start by thanking our witnesses for being here and thanking them for their service to our country. Both have served our country in various capacities for a long time. Not an easy thing to do. I respect and appreciate that work and look forward to continuing to work with you. The good news I want to start with is that, unlike last year, we have a budget agreement. And last year we spent a lot of time talking about how difficult it is to run, well, anything in the government, but certainly the Department of Defense, without appropriations bills in a timely manner. Now, last year we were off by, I don't know, 3.5 months, something like that, but that's better than drifting into the next year. We did get appropriations bills and an authorizing bill done by December of last year, which gives some predictability to the department. I think that is enormously important. This year, we hope to come a little bit closer to October 1st, certainly on the authorizing bill, but also in the appropriations bill. But most importantly, we have a budget number, and hopefully we can get that predictability in place. I think the second thing that is very important is something we've heard a great deal about, and that is the so-called blank slate review that the Department of Defense is doing. And I want to say I think that is perfectly appropriate, to take a hard look at what we're doing in the Department of Defense, what makes sense, what doesn't, and what our strategy should be going forward. And I think that this is the great challenge of this budget. We can go through the line items number by number, talk about the number of ships, the number of planes, but what is the strategy? And I think we are still struggling to get a clear, coherent strategy in place. As the history lessons go, we had the Cold War. We had a clear strategy during the Cold War, and then we developed a post-Cold War strategy, and now for a number of years we have been in the post-Cold War period. I don't think we've still quite worked out what that strategy should be. We have a number of complex challenges. We've heard about great power competition. The terrorist threat is still present. We deal with Iran. We deal with North Korea. And the thing that I think is most concerning to me, and the Secretary and I have talked about this, is that right now we have ambitious goals that outstrip our means. And that means in too many cases we are asking people serving in the military to do things that we don't have the resources to do. And I don't know the exact stats on this, but I do consistently hear that our combatant commanders, they make requests for assets. And a frequent complaint from people advocating for one program or another is, do you realize that we only met 40% of CENTCOM's requests last year for aircraft carriers or whatever, fill in the blank. There are countless statistics exactly like that, where whatever the combatant commanders ask for, they get maybe half, maybe less of what they ask for. And a lot of people look at that and panic and say, oh my gosh, we're not meeting our needs. I look at that and say our strategy is fundamentally wrong. If we are setting up an expectation that we're not even half meeting, then we don't have the right strategy. Because it's not like we're not spending a fair amount of money. $738 billion plus some emergency money last year, projected to be $741 billion this year. We need to rationalize our strategy to our resources, to understand what we can do, and most importantly, to figure out how to balance the risk. And I'm not, unmindful of the fact that if we decide to do less, there is risk attached to that. But thinking you can do absolutely everything when you can't also comes with a fair amount of risk. And that's why I do think I wouldn't have called it a blank slate review personally, because I think we do have lessons from the past that we should simply not wipe out. But that's just the philosophical point. However you want to look at it, bottom up, start over. I think a review of our strategy is perfectly appropriate, and we look forward to hearing more of the details about that. One important aspect of this continues to be the audit issue, which is enormously important. I certainly want to thank the Secretary, and I know the Deputy Secretary has spent a lot of time on this as well, and progress has been made. Progress from an absolutely unforgivably abysmal situation to one that is simply merely bad. We still don't know where we spend our money in many instances. Transfers are not adequately accounted for. We don't know the assets that we possess. There's a legacy reason for that, but it is something we still need to be committed to fixing, because in an era of scarce resources, making sure that we are spending those resources wisely, or at a minimum we know where we're spending them, becomes all the more important. So we want to make sure we emphasize that. But overall, I think we've heard a lot about the AFRICOM situation, because that's where the blank slate review started with AFRICOM. I think getting a deep dive on the thinking behind that will be very appropriate. There are two issues beyond that basic challenge that I do want to bring up and I'm concerned about. Number one is the money that is once again being diverted for the wall. And there are two chunks this year. $3.8 billion has just been reprogrammed primarily out of the procurement budget into the drug interdiction account to go to building the wall. This is an enormous problem. And for the moment, I'll put aside a debate about the wisdom of building the wall and simply focus on the wisdom of simply walking in and taking money out of the Pentagon budget that was otherwise authorized and appropriated and spending it on the wall. I think that is very, very damaging to the Pentagon. Obviously, it creates, in this case, a $3.8 billion hole, but also the message it sends is that the Pentagon's got plenty of money. We just got this long list from the services of their, quote, unfunded requirements. A sentence that I think should be banished from the Department of Defense's language, because if it's a requirement and it's unfunded, then that sends a very dangerous message. We ought to be able to meet our requirements within the budget we have, but we received, and I would have to add it up, but it was somewhere in the neighborhood of $20 to $30 billion of, quote, unfunded requirements, and at the same time, we found $3.8 billion just sitting in a corner that can go to a purpose that was not intended. It undercuts any argument about the need for resources within the Department of Defense, and it also undercuts the congressional process. I do understand the 1976 emergency law and what's involved in it, but this basically says that Congress doesn't spend the money, the President does. And I think that is a violation of our constitutional responsibility and significantly undercuts the Department of Defense. And make no mistake about it, these decisions have an impact. I've mentioned the $3.8 billion from procurement. There is still $3.6 billion now to be taken out of the MILCON budget for this year, FY20. That's not counting the $3.6 billion that was taken out last year. And that has a very real impact. I was just in Europe, actually, and Africa, visiting with European Command in Stuttgart. And there are a couple of MILCON projects that are part of our European Defense Initiative that we are now not able to fund because that money was taken for the wall. These are particularly important because these are projects that were done in partnership with our NATO allies. And if our NATO allies cannot even rely on us to come through on I forget the exact amount of money, I think it was in the tens of millions, maybe just over $100 million MILCON project, if we can't come through with that, how much can they rely on us when we make a promise that we don't keep for something as simple as that? Meanwhile, Russia is very aggressively pushing for greater influence in that region. We have to be a reliable partner to offer an alternative to what Russia wants to offer. And this effort to keep stealing money for the wall is really undermining the Department of Defense, and something regardless of how you feel about the wall, we should have a bipartisan consensus that should not be done. The last issue I want to raise is surrounding the JEDI contract, which, as I understand it, the court has once again slowed down. Not once again, I think this is the first time the court has done it. Department of Defense had done it before. Part of our modernization effort, part of a blank slate review to understand how new technology is important, what legacy systems we can get off of. Technology is crucial to this, and the cloud is crucial to this as well. I don't care who gets the contract, to be perfectly honest with you. I just want to move forward with the process. And this is an issue, actually, that the ranking member has done a great deal of work on, is to try to speed up the procurement and acquisition process so that we can take advantage of new technology more quickly. In an era of incredibly rapid change and the need to upgrade your technology, the slow bureaucratic process in the Pentagon is a significant impediment. We've tried to find ways to clean that up. Where the JEDI contract is concerned, we have the President, once again, inserting himself into the debate and causing a problem. Now, I don't know exactly what happened, but unquestionably, a judge decided that because the President specifically, apparently, said that he didn't want the contract to go to Amazon because he has some beef with Jeff Bezos, we are now slowed down in our ability to properly defend this country. We cannot continually have petty differences, petty vengeance that the president wants to exercise on people he disagrees with interfere with policy. We've seen it in the intel community. We've seen it in the Justice Department. We do not want to see it in the Department of Defense. And I hope people understand, I'm not making a partisan point. I'm not choosing sides in the argument. We should not let the personal preferences of the president get in the way of good policy. If he has something he wants to decide on a pure policy standpoint, that's fine. But if it's petty and personal, it is not worth what it does to the Department of Defense and elsewhere. Again, I want to thank the Secretary and the Chairman for being here. It's incredibly important that you're doing the review you're doing. This is a complex situation. We cannot do everything we would like to do, which means you got to make tough choices. You got to make tough choices about how to properly balance the risk. What is the best way to defend the country? How can we leverage alliances, whole of government approach, so that we don't have an excessively militaristic approach to meeting our national security needs? Balancing all that is difficult, and it definitely takes a sort of start over approach, a thorough review of where we're at, where we should spend our money, and how best to meet our national security needs. I look forward to the discussion with the members, and again, I thank our witnesses for being here. With that, I yield to the ranking member for any opening statement he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me begin by joining you in thanking our witnesses for being here, but even more importantly, thanking each of them for their service. As you point out, this is a challenging security environment. It's also a challenging political environment. And to be charged with what I believe is the first function of the federal government to defend the country is a significant responsibility, and I appreciate the service of both the Secretary and the Chairman. I also appreciate the effort the Department has made to have a budget that reflects a strategy. We haven't had that in quite a while, and I think it's absolutely true that the strategy is imperfect and the budget is imperfect. The old you can't turn an aircraft carrier on a dime analogy has some application. But there is at least a concept around which we can make spending decisions. And so I appreciate the effort that the Department has put into doing so. There are tough choices, and especially with a fixed top line, it will be a significant challenge for Congress to make these choices in a way that reflects the long-term security interests of the country. I also want to say I appreciate the efforts the Secretary has made for the defense-wide review. It is something we have talked about in this committee, trying to get more value out of the taxpayer dollars for the benefit of the warfighter. And again, we may agree or disagree with some of the specific choices, but the point is trying to not only make reductions in some areas, but to make reforms also that can result in more for the warfighter. I have to also make some comments about the recent reprogramming. Article 1, Section 8 says it's Congress's responsibility, not just our authority, but our responsibility to provide and maintain, raise and support, make the rules and regulations for the military forces of the United States. There have been decades, literally decades, of practice where if there are changing needs, money can be moved within the department budget with the approval of Congress. That has not taken place in this most recent reprogramming. Now, you can argue that last year there was the MILCON and the other thing, but there was excess funds in the Army personnel account because they didn't meet their recruiting goals, and so that money could be used for other purposes. This year is very different. This is not taking excess funds. This is substituting the judgment of the department for, and actually the administration. This, I think, my opinion is, this is not totally at the discretion of the Secretary. It is substituting the judgment of the administration for the judgment of Congress. by reducing specific weapon systems that had been authorized and appropriated. We made a different judgment call than the administration's budget request. And in effect, what the administration does is say, we don't care what has been authorized and appropriated, we're going to do what we darn well want. In this room, as long as I've been in here, I think a fair amount about the guy that's just to the right of the TV screen there, Carl Vinson, for whom this room is named. In his History of the Second World War, Victor David Hansen said that the American fleet that broke the back of the Japanese Navy in 1943-44 was designed and approved before Pearl Harbor, mostly through the efforts of one naval visionary, Congressman Carl Vinson, chairman of the House Naval Affairs Committee, who from 34 to 40 pushed through 5 successive bills to expand and reconfigure the Navy. In other words, he had a different judgment call than the Roosevelt administration, and because of what he did, we were able to break the back of the Japanese Navy in 1943-45. Different judgment calls we've made, and the list is long. Predators, MRAPs, ISR aircraft, A-10s. We have made different judgment calls for years. And while our history, again, is not perfect, it looks pretty good. But to me, it's not just that sometimes we're right, sometimes we're wrong. It is the constitutional issue. And let me just quote again Carl Vinson, because he got into a tussle with the second Secretary of Defense, Lewis Johnson. And he said, Congress provides the forces, the president commands them. If we ever get this principle of our government distorted, our whole fabric of government will be in jeopardy. It is whether the Congress will say what kind of defense the nation will have, or whether the creature of the Congress, the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Lewis Johnson, will tell us what kind of defense he will let the Congress have. This is a deeper issue than the wall. I support physical barriers on the border. I support walls, but I am deeply concerned about where we're headed with the constitutional issue about Congress's role in national defense and whether that is being overridden. We need to hit on all cylinders in national defense. There are too many challenges out there for us, and I'm afraid that the result of this will be greater restrictions on the department's ability to move money around, to meet changing needs, and the country will suffer as a result. I hope I'm proved wrong, but I'm concerned about where this is headed. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, distinguished members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to testify in support of the President's budget request for fiscal year 2021. I'm joined today by the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley. The 2018 National Defense Strategy provides a clear roadmap for the Department of Defense to address the reemergence of long-term strategic competition from near-peer competitors, China, then Russia. Throughout the Pentagon and the Joint Force, the NDS guides our decisions and actions as we adapt the force to simultaneously contend with the threats of today while preparing for the challenges of tomorrow. We do this by increasing the readiness and lethality of our warfighters, strengthening our alliances and partnerships, and reforming the way that the Department does business. Additionally, we have placed renewed emphasis on taking care of our service members and their families. The Department is grateful for the strong support provided in the FY20 NDAA and DoD appropriations, which allowed us to make vital investments in our military's modernization, enabled the creation of the United States Space Force, and provide our service members with the largest pay increase in a decade. Our continued success is contingent upon predictable, adequate, sustained, and timely funding, and I encourage Congress to pass a full-year spending package for FY21 on time to avoid the debilitating effects of another continuing resolution. The Department's total FY21 budget request is $705.4 billion. This represents a minor increase from the FY20 enacted amount of $704.6 billion, but does not keep pace with inflation. Given this flattened funding level, we were required to make many tough decisions to ensure our highest priorities were adequately funded. To enable our decision-making, we conducted a comprehensive defense-wide review, aimed at reallocating resources from programs and activities that offer low return on investment relative to the goals and objectives of the NDS. Over a 4-month period, we conducted over 20 review sessions examining almost $100 billion in programs, agencies, and activities that make up the Fourth Estate. This review generated $5.7 billion in FY21 savings that were reinvested back into readiness and lethality efforts. Each of the military services is also instituting a similar review process across their budgets to achieve the same outcome of realigning resources and finding savings that can be reinvested into higher priorities. Additionally, this is the third review, I've initiated the process of conducting full reviews of all combatant commands, to properly align our global military posture to the NDS. This effort will enable the Department to shift greater emphasis to our higher priority region, the Indo-Pacific, or allow us to return troops home to build readiness. Thus far, we have ongoing reviews of AFRICOM and SOUTHCOM, and will expand to other commands over the coming months. My recent decision to deploy elements of an Army Security Force Assistance Brigade to Africa to replace units from a brigade combat team is an example of how this process is enabling us to better match resources to the mission of each combatant command. The Department's FY21 budget reflects this same disciplined adherence to the NDS. To preserve our overmatch, we have made significant investments into several critical technologies that will alter the future battlefield. Our RDT&E budget is the largest in our history and prioritizes hypersonics, microelectronics, 5G communications, autonomous systems, and artificial intelligence. We are moving forward with long overdue recapitalization of the nation's nuclear triad, with key investments in the ground-based strategic deterrent, the B-21 stealth bomber, the Columbia-class submarine, and improved nuclear command, control, and communication systems, to name a few. We are also enhancing our missile defense capabilities to protect against the growing threat of advanced enemy missile defense systems. This budget request expands our capacity to defend our interests in space as we consolidate much of our space enterprise into the Space Force. It also advances the Department's cyber capabilities, allowing us to protect our digital infrastructure while disrupting covert foreign malign activity. This includes defending the integrity of our democracy by assisting in the security of our elections. The Department appreciates this committee's advocacy of the National Defense Strategy, and we value Congress's guidance on reform. I now ask for your support so that we may fully implement our decisions and move forward with the investments needed to ensure America's military maintains our competitive advantage, continues to deter conflict, and preserves our nation's security. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to join Secretary Esper here today. It's my distinct honor and privilege to represent the almost 3 million soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardsmen, and civilians of the United States Armed Forces, the best trained, best equipped, and best led military force in the world, and we cannot do it without your continued support. This budget is a strategy-driven budget. It is driven by the NDS, which you are fully aware of, and I fully support. We stand ready and capable today to deter war, defend our homeland from attack, support our allies, and fight and win our nation's wars against any potential adversary anywhere on the Earth's surface or subsurface. But our competitive advantage has eroded, and no one should have any doubt about that. China and Russia are increasing their military capabilities to outmatch the United States and its allies in order to exert their global influence. North Korea, Iran, and violent extremist organizations fuel regional instability and pose threats to partner nations and U.S. citizens. And while the nature of war is constant, advanced technologies have stressed our industrial age capabilities, concepts, and processes, changing the very character of war in a fundamental way. Additionally, we are recovering from readiness shortfalls and modernization deferments over about 20 years now of continuous warfare and a decade of budget instability. This year's budget builds on previous readiness and modernization gains, and I believe the 21 budget submission is the best allocation of resources. It's balanced in support of the National Defense Strategy. It builds a more lethal force, it strengthens allies and partners, and it reforms the Department for greater performance and affordability. It also prioritizes, as the Secretary said, the Indo-Pacific region to deter Chinese aggression, maintain stability, and ensure access to the common domains in order to preserve a free and open international system. Additionally, this budget accounts for continued efforts in Europe to counter Russian aggression, and it will continue to allow the United States military, in concert with our allies and partners, to deter a provocative North Korea or Iran from aggressive actions in their regions while conducting counterterrorist operations in various parts of the world. In short, PB 21 supports a ready, agile, and capable joint force that can compete, deter, and win across all domains today and in the future, and it targets specific investments in readiness, modernization, leader development, and support to our people, our soldiers, our sailors, our airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen, and our families. It invests in our readiness recovery that was built over the last 3 years, and with this committee's support, all services are scheduled to meet their readiness recovery goals inside this FYDP. It funds modernization for great power competition across all the warfighting domains, and it improves the safety, security, reliability of our nuclear enterprise. It invests and stands up the Space Force and increases the resiliency, deterrence, capability, and warfighting options in both space and cyber. It funds joint all-domain command and control to improve our interoperability across all the services and with our allies, and invests in advanced technologies that the Secretary listed to address more complex threats and a faster pace in this changing character of war. This budget invests also, and finally, in our most valued asset, the United States Armed Forces, our people. It also funds facilities, infrastructure, family support, and quality of life programs, and it invests in the education and talent management processes to develop our junior leaders with the values and intellectual ability to fight and win future conflicts, the captains and ensigns of today who will be the admirals and generals of tomorrow. Ultimately, our military needs sustained, predictable, adequate, and timely funding to retain its competitive advantage in this era of great power competition, with the understanding that we must be good stewards of the resources entrusted to us by Congress and the American people. I want to thank this committee for your continued support to our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and our families, and I look forward to asking or answering your questions.
Thank you very much. We will now move on to question and answer. As we go through, we've got a lot of people. It's going to be very difficult to get through. The one thing is every member has 5 minutes. And as I've said before, you can't ask the question for 4 minutes and 45 seconds and then get a 3-minute answer. I will try to let you gentlemen finish, but as we hit 5 minutes, if you could wrap up so we can move on to the next one, that would enable us to get to as many members as possible. I just want to ask about the blank slate review and just start from that point. If you could give us a little insight into how that worked, and AFRICOM is where you started. So if you could just, well, I mean, obviously there were other issues there. AFRICOM was the first command that you looked at. And there's been a lot of press reporting on this, most of it inaccurate, I'm aware. But if you could tell us, when you looked at it, did you contemplate, well, let's just pull all the forces out of Africa? Was that contemplated? If so, how far did that get? And then what was the analysis in terms of how you looked at our interests in Africa and the role that our forces could play and the risks that you were balancing, where you were going to send them? Just walk us through a little bit the specifics of how you did that, because this is one piece of what you're going to be doing in a lot of other places as well.
So first of all, Mr. Chairman, there are 3 reviews ongoing right now. I mentioned them in my opening statement. One is review the combatant commands. I'll talk about that here in a minute. The second is the defense-wide review led by the CMO. And the third are the service reviews of their budgets. With regard to the combatant command reviews, you hit the nail on the head at the beginning. What I'm trying to do is make sure we are aligned to the NDS, but secondly, that we can get into better equilibrium, demand, which is way up here, and supply, which is down here. This is what's driving our force in the ground in many instances in burning readiness. And so the way we began this process, concurrently with the Joint Staff, what the Joint Staff did was looked at all the combatant commands and went through 2 or 3 decades worth and discovered that these respective commands all have hundreds of tasks and requirements placed on them that the combatant commanders are working hard to achieve and resource. And that review is ongoing. In the case of AFRICOM, it was easily over 1,000. So as we looked at each command, what I want to make sure as I gave guidance to them is to make sure that they came back to me and presented a range of options that made sure that we prioritize what we need to do. First, do you have the resources you need to meet your wartime and your contingency plans? Second, great power competition. And then third, it starts becoming unique to the theater. In the case of AFRICOM, what are your missions with regard to counterterrorism and how are you resourcing it? With Southcom, it's the same first 2, but the third becomes counter-drug, counter-narcotics, and there's some other missions. And then what we've been engaging now on over a series of months are back and forth as we look at different questions and issues and considerations. There are no plans to completely withdraw all forces from Africa. That's been misreported and repeated over and over again. But what I am looking to do is to make sure that I can resource the missions that are actually required and to right-size the force consistent with that and the need to build readiness across the force so I can deal with China, then Russia, as part of the NDS.
Can you give us just an example of something you've identified in any one of those reviews where it's like, yeah, that's something we don't need to do anymore? And I'm not saying that it's unimportant or irrelevant, but you looked at it and said, we need to move off of that because it's not the best use of our dollars in that case, whether in Africa or in the services or wherever.
Well, no decisions have been made yet on Southcom. The only decision I've made so far in AFRICOM was to replace a regular infantry unit from the 101st with a Security Force Assistance Brigade. It makes great sense in terms of great power competition because a Security Force Assistance Brigade is trained, organized, equipped to do that mission, to provide training that's important to forces on the ground as we try and make sure we compete and improve their capabilities. Whereas an infantry battalion doesn't have that. The infantry battalion in this case need to go back home so they can prepare for great power competition. So that's an example where just swapping out the forces really gets your great power competition to a different level. So that's a case in point. We have found in the theaters, and the chairman may want to speak to this, over the years we've stacked up crisis response forces and have held them pending, and in cases we never actually use them. And so we're looking at how do we make sure we get those special operation forces and others back to where we can meet the needs if there's a crisis, but at the same token not allow the others to go back and retain a better readiness posture. That is one issue that's coming up. I have not made any decisions on that yet, but that's something that I think we all recognize. The chairman may want to comment on that one about these are the things that we are uncovering, and we are uncovering a lot of things as we go through this process.
Just very briefly, pick the red pen up first. We have to do an intel analysis of not only the globe, but in specific areas. So do a rigorous intelligence analysis of the actual threats that are in Africa relative to our national security vital interests. Take terrorism as an example. There's a lot of terrorist organizations in groups in Africa. Not all are created equal. So we got to parse all of those out, determine which ones are actual threats to the United States, and make sure we right size and we have the right type of force in the right place, the right time to meet that. Same thing with China, Russia, and great power competition, for example, in Africa. Are they at the right place, the right time, and so on? We have multiple things that have been built up over 20, 30 years in XORs and OPWARDs, and we're going through that and editing it and making sure that it's rational, rational in accordance with the NDS. The Secretary mentioned the crisis response forces, but there's other things out there. Take the Sinai, for example. Camp David Accord signed in 1981. I served in the Sinai. Is that still a valid mission for U.S. military forces? Yes, no. Arguments to be made on both sides. We're going through all that kind of stuff, every single task and purpose out there for the United States military, from space down to undersea. Does it still make sense in accordance with the NDS? Is it warranted with this changing character of war and so on? And if yes, check, continue, pass go, collect 200. If not, then we delete it.
Thank you.
I was in, just a quick anecdote. I was in Stratcom last week. Admiral Richard, who runs Stratcom, has a tasking on his books that dates to the 1960s. He can't even find out where it came from. And in the present context, it doesn't make any sense. And so as I had my initial discussion with him about his review, those are the things we're trying to undo, because if you look at the mission, if it doesn't make sense, it frees up resources, time, money, and manpower that I can put back into higher priority things.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Thornberry.
Mr. Secretary, we are about to embark on trying to write a defense authorization bill for what would be the 59th straight year if it's signed into law. And I guess my basic question to you is it going to matter? Or will OMB send down a directive saying we don't, even though it's signed into law, authorized and appropriated, we're going to take away some money for some planes or satellites or something and move it to other things?
Mr. Thornberry, what the Congress does matters. It matters very much. And we look to the Congress as partners as we try and develop our game plan to serve the country, defend the country, and help us implement the NDS.
Well, as I've already expressed some of the concerns I have, I hope we can be partners because I think the country is stronger as a result. Mr. Chairman, let me just ask you briefly before we get into all of the should we spend more on this or less on that sort of questions. Help us provide some context for the situation we find ourselves in. If you were to give a brief description to the Rotary Club in Amarillo, Texas, about how warfare has changed, in other words, the context for which tough choices have to be made, a different strategy has to be in place, how would you encapsulate that in a brief description?
I'm not sure it could be brief, Congressman Thornberry, but I guess as brief as I can. Technology has influenced warfare throughout the ages, and today is no different. And we're probably in one of the greatest shifts in the character of war, not the nature. Nature of war is all about politics, friction, uncertainty, etc., fear, violence. That's war, the nature of war. But the character of war changes very frequently. It changes largely driven by technology, but there's other reasons, societal reasons as well. But in today's day and age, it's changing very, very rapidly because of precision munitions, the ability of our sensors that are available to many, many countries, our ability to see and determine where people are, where things are throughout the world, and that which you can see, you can hit. The range at which we can engage is much, much longer today than it's ever been in human history. There's a wide variety of emerging technologies that are converging in time and space that are going to have significant military implication. Artificial intelligence is huge. Hypersonics, robotics, and there's a laundry list of about 20 or 30 additional emerging technologies. All of that is going to change the fundamental character of war, how we fight, the weapons we fight with, the methods, the doctrines, etc. We're living through that right now. What is really the challenge for the United States and for other countries is who is going to adapt to that changing character with the most speed, and who's going to have it about right. You're never going to get it perfect, but you got to get it right more than your adversary gets it right. And that's going to determine, in large respect, whether or not we prevail in some sort of conflict against our next adversary. There's a lot at stake here. This budget, what it does is it lays the foundations. It doesn't create that future for us, but it does lay the foundation with research, development, science, technology, and a few other lines of effort that lead us into the future.
Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to both of you. Thank you for your service, for joining us today. I want to follow up with both the chairman and the ranking member's comments regarding the transfer of funds that the Congress has not approved. As we know, there have been a lot of comments about budget predictability from Congress, and I appreciate that. I think that's the right way to go, of course. But could you tell us what funds are you planning on transferring to the wall on 2021 so that we can find a better use for those dollars now?
Thanks, Congresswoman. The funds, the sourcing would be from FY $20 that were either ahead of need or excess to need. In other words, not requested in the FY20 budget by the department. If
they were not requested, and if they are not important, if they're not a high priority, why are they there? And aren't there many, many more uses that we have for those dollars?
They are there because Congress put them there.
If they are there because we put them there and you didn't believe that they were important or a high priority, was there a discussion about that that you felt you couldn't change? And it seems to me that we have to be doing what's the most important. Mm-hmm. And the message that you're sending is that these projects, and some of them are critically important. Some of them involve major vehicles. The Air Force, there's so many things that have been touched by that, mm-hmm. that it sends a message that the military doesn't need that money. How do we respond then to constituents that see us cutting out areas where we made a strong commitment not to refill, to pay back those dollars, and yet, we're sitting here without having been involved in that decision, the transfer decision specifically.
Sure. Look, I understand what you're saying, Congresswoman. The President has determined that we have a national emergency on our southwest border. That to deal with that emergency, that we need a barrier system That barrier system development, which is led by DHS, requires the support of DOD. And that's our role in this process, supporting DHS.
Is the southern border security in the National Defense Strategy?
Homeland Security is in the National Defense Strategy, and it's one of the things that administrations have supported in the past with regard to security of the southern border.
Because I wanted to point out that the word border only appears once in the National Defense Strategy, and it's about Russia violating sovereign borders.
Right. Homeland Security is in the National Defense Strategy. There's a lot of things we do that aren't in the National Defense Strategy. We help people during floods. We help people during hurricanes. We help put out wildfires in the West. I mean, there's a lot of things that we do that aren't always captured, but it's the nature of what we do when the nation calls upon us to support.
Well, I think that if there are areas that you know that you're going to tap for part of your strategy on the border, which is not in the National Defense Strategy, then I think that's important for Congress to know, because you're telling us that that's not very important.
Congresswoman, there's a lot of things that we do that are not in the National Defense Strategy. That's what we're trying to clean up as we do our review here with the COCOMs and with the rest of the services.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. General Milley, if I could just turn to you for a second. The National Nuclear Security Administration still has about $8 billion left in unspent funds from last year, and that's half their FY20 budget. So is it in your best military advice that cutting a Virginia-class submarine to increase the NNSA's budget by 20% is good prioritization?
No, it is not, ma'am. In that particular case, I wasn't personally involved in the decision on that. However, that was a case where there was some internal deliberations at the last minute to make sure that that the nuclear enterprise was fully funded.
Do you believe?
Well, let me just. So it's a question of. I wasn't personally in the meeting on that one. However, had I been, I would have supported the fully funding of the nuclear enterprise. We have not had a great power war in 7.5 decades, 75 years, since World War II. A big reason for that is the United States nuclear enterprise. It's not the only reason. And I believe, and I said it in testimony previously, that the #1 priority of the United States, the budget, is to make sure that we have a safe, secure, guaranteed nuclear enterprise. And that's where that money.
We're going to have to. I apologize. We're going to have to leave it there because we're over time.
I would have supported it.
Understood. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Secretary Esper and Chairman Milley. Thank you for being with us here today to discuss the fiscal year 2021 Defense Authorization Budget request. The United States faces complex and dynamic security environments, and thankfully, President Donald Trump's budget for the national security matters promotes peace through strength. And Secretary Esper, I want to let you know how much I appreciated joining you touring and visiting the troops at Fort Jackson last year, and then you not only observed, but then you joined the troops in rappelling from the tower. And that was very impressive, your identification with our new trainees. Secretary Esper, American strategic nuclear forces are critical, as has been so correctly cited by Chairman Milley, to deterring our adversaries. President Trump has made clear his priority of the Department of Defense is to modernize our aging nuclear enterprises. Can you provide the committee with an update where China and Russia are with their nuclear capabilities and why we need to modernize and expand our American nuclear programs?
With respect to Russia, they have the only country on the earth that represents an actual, no-kidding, existential threat to the United States of America. Every man, woman, and child could be killed by the Russians. And we can do the same to them. And they know that, and we know that, hence mutually assured destruction, hence deterrence. So maintaining a guaranteed nuclear enterprise is critical relative to Russia. With respect to China, their nuclear enterprise is growing and growing rapidly. And us having a modernized nuclear enterprise is fundamental to the security of the United States in the out years. And we are at a point now where we have to modernize and invest in the triad in order to assure ourselves security in the future. It's very expensive, and I know that. We all recognize that. But it's absolutely critical to the security of the United States.
Thank you very much. And then, Secretary Esper, We're grateful that the U.S. Army Cyber Command is our next-door neighbor at Fort Gordon. It's important to defend our cyber networks and infrastructure. Acting Secretary of the Navy Thomas Modly said 5 days ago, it's not so much the top-tier suppliers, but it's the second and third-tier suppliers that have a lot of vulnerabilities that we've discovered, end of quote. What is being done by the department to address this threat, and what industries are most vulnerable?
Mr. Wilson, I think as you, across the entire industrial base, as you move from the primes all the way down through the supply chain, the further you get out there, the more vulnerable they typically are to cyber influence, tampering, et cetera. So I know our folks in research and engineering and acquisition and sustainment are working on programs where we might be able to assist them with that surety. I met recently, had dinner with a number of company CEOs where we discussed the same issue, but we have to do a whole lot better job and help these extended tier, second, third, fourth tier suppliers improve their cybersecurity so that we have confidence in the systems once they come together and provide us that capability.
Thank you very much. And then Chairman Milley, I believe that the F-35 and fifth generation aircraft are essential to securing and maintaining U.S. air superiority. However, as a multi-role fighter, can you tell us from your perspective what the F-35 brings to the fight in support of ground troops? How is the F-35 a game changer for the troops on the ground?
Well, as someone who has been in a fair share of ground contact, the very first call you ever make, frankly, when the bullets are flying, you call for attack helicopters or you call for close air support. And an F-35 is the premier fighter bomber in the world. It's an incredible aircraft. It's obviously very, very expensive, but it's an incredible aircraft. And it will be a significant weapon system in support of ground forces in the future. And it also, one thing on the air-to-air piece, is that the United States Army and Marine Corps have not come under sustained enemy air attack really since Normandy. And I think there was one attack during Vietnam or maybe the Korean War or something like that, but nothing sustained. Why is that? It's because we have the most unbelievable Air Force the world has ever seen. And we not only maintain air superiority, we get air supremacy across the board. And that's what that F-35 is all about, making sure that we don't lose soldiers and Marines on the ground from enemy air. So it'll clear the skies, maintain supremacy, and also perform a close air support role.
Well, we're grateful that F-35s are located in Marine Corps Air Station Beaufort. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for your testimony here today and for all you do on behalf of our nation and keeping us safe. I want to follow up just on commenting on the issue that my colleague, Ms. Davis, raised on the Virginia-class submarine. I want to express my very strong concern that the budget only includes one Virginia-class sub rather than two. This is against the recommendation of combatant commanders, while nuclear modernization, of course, is certainly important and very important. We shouldn't be financing it with funding for an attack submarine. So this is something that we're going to be very following closely through the NDA reauthorization process, the appropriation process, given the demands for the Virginia-class submarines by our combatant commanders and a very small percentage of the requests that they make really are only fulfilled. And our enemies and adversaries have a high build rate on submarines right now, and their growing capabilities. It's something that we need to be concerned about. I don't think that's an area that we can afford to be cutting. But that being said, I want to go to another issue on the issue of climate change. In FY18, and the NDA, I authored legislation that instructed each service to assess the risks of climate change on the military facilities. Secretary, I appreciate when you were Secretary of the Army, the list that you sent back to the committee identifying those bases. But the implications of climate change are indisputable. The department manages more than 1,700 military installations in worldwide coastal areas that may be affected by sea level rise. Hurricane Michael and Florence, just by way of example, caused an estimated $8.3 billion in damage. Secretary Esper, do you agree that the changing climate poses a threat to our readiness and ability to achieve military objectives?
Thank you, Mr. Longevin. I agree, as I think we reported as the chairman and I when we were at the Army, is that climate change poses a challenge for our installations and making sure that we can maintain installation readiness to support our forces. We discovered this in the Army. The biggest challenge we faced was, for example, I think as you and I spoke, was desertification out west at many of our bases. So it is something I'm aware of. I know we have faced a challenge in Norfolk with rising tides. It's something we have to plan on to make sure we can address it so we maintain a strong installational base.
Is it affecting our readiness?
I don't think it's affecting our readiness right now. I'd have to dig into that and get back to you to give you a more sound answer, but it's not been reported to me that it's affecting our readiness presently.
Do you agree that we need to make investments today in order to mitigate the risks that we do face and that we will face in the short, medium, and the long terms? And what would some of those investments be?
Sure. No, I think we do where it's appropriate and where we can make a difference. And so I mentioned Norfolk. I believe is concerned about, again, rising tide, what it may do to the dry docks, and I think the Navy is investing in that. But again, that's something I'd like to come back to you on. But we are looking at those issues and tracking them and making appropriate investments.
Well, will you commit to working with me and my colleagues, the Department of Work, to determine the appropriate investments necessary to protect our national security from climate change?
Sure.
Thank you. On another topic, on cyber security, Secretary Esper, over the last year, I've had the privilege to serve on the Cyber Solarium Commission and work with your colleagues, Deputy Secretary of Defense David Norquist and Assistant Secretary Ken Rapuano. I appreciate their contributions to the discussion and the work product in the coming weeks. The Commission is going to outline a strategy of layered deterrence to protect the nation from the many threats that we face from cyberspace. Secretary, will you commit to working with me and Congressman Gallagher, who is one of the co-chairs of the Solarium Commission, and also Senator King and the members of the Commission, and also the members of this committee, to implement the many legislative recommendations outlined in the forthcoming Commission report where we can find agreement and where practicable?
Yes, Congressman, I do. I look forward to working with you on it. I've gotten positive feedback from well with regard to that effort, so thank you for your contributions.
Thank you. In our discussion the other day when we had an opportunity to talk by phone, I expressed my concern also about the rebalance potential of forces in AFRICOM, and I want to just express my concern there that leaving power vacuums will not go obviously unfilled. Our enemies and adversaries, China, Russia, are going to look to fill those areas, and I would ask you to work with the committee before any decisions are made so that we understand the costs and benefits of that rebalancing in Africa should it occur.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I want to begin by acknowledging that there is probably nobody in this room who's more disappointed than you that there are funds being taken from the Department of Defense to secure our border. Securing our border obviously is an issue of our national defense, but it is Congress's failure to act, not your actions, that are resulting in dollars being taken from the Department of Defense budget. It is our congressional law that allows the president to take these funds to secure our border, which has already been upheld by the Supreme Court. Congress's failure to act is the failure to actually provide the funds necessary to secure our border. We all know you don't have too much money. You have other resources and other responsibilities you'd like to apply those funds to. So I certainly hope that as people, although we're fond to criticize you for this, realize this is a criticism that should be directed toward Congress, and that we should take an action to backfill those funds and give the president the funds necessary to secure our border. Mr. Secretary, I want to congratulate you on your comments at Munich and your focus with respect to China. I spoke at events with the Atlantic Council, the Potsdam Foundation, Hudson Institute, and the German Marshall Fund. I want you to know your comments resonated, both with our German counterparts, our U.S. counterparts, and also with our NATO allies. And specifically with respect to Huawei, I think your comments made a tremendous difference, and I appreciate both you participating and speaking out. I also want to thank you for having attended Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and going and touring NASIC. It made a tremendous difference to the more than 3,000 people that you know contribute directly to our intelligence every day. And I want to raise an issue with respect to NASIC. Two questions for you, one with respect to Space Force and NASIC, and the second with respect to our nuclear enterprise. in standing up Space Force, you've said that it is our intention to advance our space capabilities and our defense of our assets and looking at that as a warfighting domain. You've indicated that you do not want duplication of services. But obviously, as you know, there are a number of people who are concerned as Space Force has stepped up, not that it would, that they might go to Space Force, but their job might and that they might not instead. So anything that you could say in protection of our centers of excellence that they're not at risk as you're looking at standing up Space Force and you want to actually augment and support those would be helpful. And with respect to nuclear modernization, I want to thank you for David Norquist's work and your support for the NNSA. And if you could speak for a moment, because we're going to have to debate those funds, about what Russia is doing and how it is a threat to us, because they're not just modernizing their nuclear weapons, they're creating new ones. And what does that mean as we debate our budget? Secretary.
Sure. Just quickly, I just want to say thank you for hosting me at Wright Pat, and I did have a great visit to NASIC. They do exceptional work, and as we look forward to how we organize Space Force, obviously you're not looking for duplication, and I don't want to break something that's working. So you and I talked about that before. I'll take it back and make sure that works into all the calculations and make sure we consult with you as things evolve. But they do great work there, and thank you for showing that to me. With regard to Russia, you're absolutely correct, Congressman. What they're doing is not just growing their strategic forces, but they're creating new capabilities, and they are improving the quality of their force as well. We talk a lot about their strategic systems. What often goes is ignored are their tactical nuclear weapons. Well, I call them the unaccountable nuclear weapons. They number nearly 2,000, and then they are battlefield weapons. We see them used in naval warfare. And that's one thing we have to pay close attention to as well with regard to their strategic forces.
So as we take a look at this budget, I mean, we're obviously going to have to look at what NNSA needs so we can modernize our forces. Now, we're only modernizing, meaning we're trying to keep the capabilities that we have, not even reach their hypersonic capabilities, their violations of the INF. Could you give us your concerns about our current nuclear enterprise and the need for those funds that are in the President's budget?
Well, the current nuclear enterprise is very old, both in terms of the platforms, which is why we're modernizing all legs of the triad, but also the packages, if you will, the devices themselves. So it's important that we get to that 80 pit per year by 2030 goal so that we have what's essential, a safe, reliable, effective, credible, secure nuclear force that can keep us safe and secure in the 2030s and well beyond. And that's going to be critical. We're not trying to get into an arms race with Russia because we're not trying to match them weapon for weapon. But what we do need to have is the essentials to keep America safe and secure, to have the different capabilities that each leg of the triad brings us with either complementary or other purposes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to yield my time to Representative Horn of Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Esper and General Milley for being here today. I'd like to turn our attention to a different issue. It's a component of our readiness that we've been doing a lot of work on over the last year that is critical, and that is our military housing. As you are both undoubtedly aware, we have had some significant issues with our privatized military housing programs. And we undertook in last year's defense authorization bill, the Tenants' Bill of Rights, and a number of other things to help address that. In the FY 2021 budget request, it contains $54.6 million for the military housing privatization initiative, which is an 82% increase from FY 2020. We know that caring for our service members and their families and ensuring that they have safe, livable housing is a critical component of our readiness. And as I understand it, this department requests for these funds are to help augment staff, improve quality control measures, develop and manage a database, and much more. We are, I think, just at the beginning. And yesterday, you signed a document that would guarantee the implementation of most of the provisions in the Tenants' Bill of Rights by May 1st. But there are a few outstanding issues I'd like to get some insight on. There are three, I think, of the most critical that will not be implemented by the 1st, and that they are the maintenance history of the housing unit, dispute resolution process, and a withholding of rent. Because at Tinker Air Force Base, right in the heart of Oklahoma, we have not seen tangible improvements in many areas that we would like to due to contractors and responsiveness. So I'd like to hear from you, since we've implemented the Tenants Bill of Rights in the beginning, the timeline for implementing those and making sure that the funds are going directly to address these critical issues.
Sure. Thank you, Congresswoman. I understand the issues at Tinker are fairly acute. You know, I was at Fort Sill last year and walked through a number of homes. It has its own separate set of issues that the chairman and I worked on previously. You're right. Last night, the service secretaries and I yesterday signed out the Tenant Bill of Rights, addressing 15 of the 18 rights that were set forth in law. Those 15 were ones we were working on contemporaneously. The 3 that we are going to require more assistance on are dispute resolution, maintenance history, and withholding of rent provisions. In these cases, they are the reason why we can't act unilaterally is because there are legal contracts between DOD and the MHPI companies with regard to that. We have a pathway on some of these to move forward to find a mutually agreeable way to meet the intent, the spirit, if not the letter of the law. But I think we're going to have to come back and work with you all as well to assist us, because these are, again, we have legal contracts between them, and we want to make sure we what I don't want to do is promise a right that I can't deliver on. The important thing is we have a deliverable right that service members can act on, because they should live in quality, safe housing. What we've seen in the past is completely unsatisfactory.
And Secretary, what I would ask of you and General Milley, that we have continued work to do on this issue. I think there is more that we need to do. So wherever you're running into roadblocks, we've got to fix this problem that's affecting the health and well-being of our service members and their families. General Milley, I want to turn to you for just a moment. The Army initiated a policy of having someone in uniform visiting every soldier's on-base housing unit so they could actually put eyes on the problem. We discovered that part of the challenge was a lack of oversight from our chain of command. And I'm wondering about when we can expect the other service branches to begin to implement this sort of policy.
Yeah, I will come back to you with an actual date, but we've discussed that amongst the Joint Chiefs, and each of the respective chiefs of not only just the Army, but the CNO, Chief Staff of the Air Force, Commandant Marine Corps, they've all committed to doing that. I trust they are doing that, but I can get back to you with specific dates on when it'll be complete.
Thank you very much. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank both of you for your attendance and for your service to our country. Ms. Secretary, in last year's NDAA, we passed language that was explicit in directing you to, quote, assign the director of the Missile Defense Agency with the principal responsibility for the development and deployment of hypersonic and ballistic tracking space sensors. That money was put in to fund that, but yet the money was redirected to the Space Development Agency. This year's funding request, you say, quote, funding responsibility has transferred from MDA to SDA for the continued hypersonic ballistic tracking space sensor development efforts. Why? Why is it not being left in MDA where we directed it to be conducted?
Yep. Mr. Rogers, my understanding is it is at MDA. If there's something misstated in our budget documents, I need to get back to you. But my understanding is it resides with MDA. It's the hypersonic and ballistic missile tracking space sensor payload, as you discussed. They both are obviously closely coordinating on that. But MDA did receive the funding for both those things, and it's 2-year funds. So
I'd ask you to revisit that, because that funding was redirected to SDA, and nothing has been done on the last year on that issue, which you know is a very important threat for us.
Right. You know, I've been down to the Arsenal, and I've walked through those programs in the past. But let me get back to you, because I'm getting a different readout from my folks, and we can reconcile that.
Thank you. You've made it clear that you're fully committed to a 355-ship Navy. And in order to get that, we're going to have to buy smaller ships that can be deployed faster. You've also said you see those being lightly manned ships. Do you think those are going to be medium or large unmanned vessels, or do you think you're going to have to get some smaller ships into the fleet mix?
Yeah, the first thing, I am committed to a 355-ship Navy, but I got to say, I actually think we need more than 355 ships. And to get there, I think what the composition needs to change, fewer large platforms, more smaller platforms. We need to have lightly manned, moving to eventually optionally manned. And I think we need more attack submarines, frankly. They have to have certain compositional characteristics. They got to have distributed awareness and lethality, survivability. They have to be sustainable over the long run. They have the ability to deliver lethal fire. So I think what we need to do is be much more aggressive in terms of experimenting and prototyping, and then quickly move to production once we feel confident. But we need to maintain the U.S. Navy as the greatest force in the world, and we need to adapt to the threats we see. The two challenges we have right now is we need to base it off of a current op plan, which we don't have, and secondly, we need to update it based on a new joint warfighting doctrine, something that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is working on. I think that will really help inform so we're prepared to deal with the challenges that we see in the 2030s, 40s, and 50s.
Great. You've also emphasized the need for a healthy industrial base, including shipyards. How do you plan to incorporate these shipyards into our industrial base?
They are absolutely critical, not just the yards, but I assume when you say yards, it's the workers as well. I've talked to several members about how do we certify, how do we give predictability in funding, how do we do those things. I think we probably need more yards to do the work to build a much, much larger Navy, and I think it's something we really have to focus on. GAO did an extensive report in December which outlined all the challenges the Navy is facing with regard to maintenance, and so much of it is based on both capacity at the yards and the training of the workforce.
Great. General Milley, the Indo-Pacific region is getting a lot of attention for good reason, given what China, Russia, and North Korea are up to. There's been some discussions about increasing the duration of rotations of the Army Specific Pathways program. Is that something you're planning to do across the services or just the Army?
No, that's across the services in terms of increasing rotations throughout Indo-Pacific. Again, in the NDS, a strategy-driven budget here, in the NDS, the Indo-Pacific was designated as the, quote, in the military terms, the main effort. That doesn't mean it's the only effort, but it's the main effort. So the preponderance of U.S. military capability in various forms, either forward-based and stationed and or cyclically rotating through for exercises and or deployments, is what we're trying to do. So it applies to all the services, not just the Army.
Okay. I've yielded about some of my time to Ms. Cheney if she has a question.
I just want to echo the concerns and the comments that you've heard about the reprogramming. I also want to know whether or not the department has decided that, contrary to what we heard repeatedly from your predecessors, an increase of 3 to 5% real growth annually is necessary in order to maintain and continue the kind of growth that we've seen in rebuilding the budget. That's not what we've seen, and if we're being forced to choose between modernizing our nuclear forces and building Virginia-class submarines, then you're not asking for enough money, and we're not providing you with the kind of regularity that you need.
The department needs
needs
3 to 5% real growth annually if we're going to fully implement the National Defense Strategy.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the spirit of Carl Vinson, I want to just talk to the two witnesses today about the 19% cut to shipbuilding in this year's budget. A couple days ago, the Congressional Research Service looked at the department's submission of the budget. Mr. O'Rourke, who knows more about shipbuilding than anybody in this town combined, actually, in his understated way, eviscerated this request. In the department's submission this morning, it states that there are 8 ships, new ships, that are in their budget plan. Mr. O'Rourke actually determined that the LPD 31, which was listed, actually we funded and authorized last year. So there's actually only 7. 2 of those 7 are tugboats. They are salvage ships. We are not getting briefings in this committee about Russian tugboats or Chinese tugboats. We, in fact, then are left with really 5 combatant ships. Mr. Secretary, I've been on the Sea Power Committee for 14 years. You have to go back to the height of the surge, when the Navy shipbuilding was a bill payer because we had 200,000 troops in a land war over in the Middle East, to see such an anemic shipbuilding request from the administration here today. And I would just say this is a punch in the gut to shipyard workers, the metal trades who are making life commitments to learn how to be welders and electricians and carpenters, to see this radical rudder turn in this year's budget in terms of shipbuilding. It is also a punch in the gut to the supply chain, who, again, we have been coaxing back into shipbuilding, again, after the lean years during the Iraq and Afghanistan war to make investments in terms of capital and hiring. Again, they're going to be on the Hill next Monday making the rounds here. BWXT from Ohio issued an earnings warning yesterday. They are the sole supplier of nuclear reactors for Navy ships because of that cut to the Virginia-class program. But lastly, it is a punch in the gut to the combatant commanders. Again, just in the last few days, we've had General Walters at European Command talk about a 50% increase in Russian submarine patrol operations. We've had Woody Lewis from the U.S. Second Fleet talking about the ever-increasing number of submarines. Admiral Davidson over in Indo-Pacific saying that his day-to-day submarine requirement is met by slightly only 50% of what I've asked for. So again, this budget fails the test in terms of a national defense strategy, which is focused on our near-peer competitors, because it is primarily an air and sea challenge when you're talking about Russia and China. And again, you don't recover from a cut like this anytime soon. Again, just for the record, we are 52 attack submarines today with the retirement of Los Angeles-class submarines, which are going to accelerate over the next 4 or 5 years. That fleet is going to shrink to 44 subs. Your budget keeps us in that trough into the 2030s. And again, it just defies any analysis in terms of something that comports with a national defense strategy, again, based on the activities that we are seeing from China and Russia. Thank goodness that Admiral Gilday, in his unfunded budget priorities, number one on his list, which he submitted a couple days ago, is to restore that Virginia-class submarine so that we at least get out of this trough, which we are going to still be contending with throughout the 2020s, and we can get closer to the goal of a 355-ship Navy. And again, Mr. O'Rourke's report, which I would ask to be admitted to the record,
with no hearing, no
makes it crystal clear that projecting out over the next 5 years, it is a cut from the Obama projection in terms of fleet size, and also keeps us further away from trying to get to the goal of the 350-ship Navy. Mr. Secretary,
can I respond?
No, let me ask a question now, okay? Article 10, Section 231 of the U.S. Code says that when a budget comes over from the Department of Defense, it shall be accompanied by a 30-year shipbuilding plan. This is not sort of a feel-good law. It's because Congress needs headlights to see where you're going because of the fact that shipbuilding is such a long game. And again, it's not like helicopters or planes. When you cut, you don't get it back. Time is of the essence. Mr. Whitman and I sent a letter to your department on February 12th asking for the 30-year shipbuilding plan, which again did not accompany the budget, and we have still not seen that 30-year shipbuilding plan today. When are we going to get that 30-year shipbuilding plan, which again is mandated by law?
I think I'm going to need more time, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, I'm sorry. You may have to take that for the record.
No,
go ahead. Take a shot.
It's a very good discussion. It's a very important discussion. So, Mr. Courtney, I haven't seen the 30-year shipbuilding plan. I'm awaiting its presentation to me. It's my report. Once I've had a chance to review it and digest it and follow up on it, at the appropriate point in time, I will share with you what I believe our future force structure should look like. With regard to the first point you made, I will say this much. I think it's a very important issue. I'm a big believer in attack submarines. I actually believe, my gut tells me we need more than what we've planned for, number one. But there are two competing pressures we have right now. A top-line budget, which actually gives us 2% less buying power. But the second thing, and importantly, is I support what the Navy did in terms of moving $4 billion, nearly $4 billion, from shipbuilding to maintenance. The concern that the CNO has, that the acting secretary has, that I have, is that we have a hollow Navy. Why do I know that? The GAO report dated December of last year said this much. Over the last 5 years, 75% of our surface ships never left maintenance on time. Of that 75%, half of those ships took over 3 months to get to sea. And what does that account for? That means.
And I know this is really important, but the other members are going to kill me.
Okay, but just last point. What that equates to is 19 ships in 2019 unavailable to go to sea. We cannot have a hollow Navy. I agree we need to build a 355-plus ship Navy, but we can't have a hollow Navy at the same time.
Thank you. Mr. Lambert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Secretary Esper and General Milley, thank you both for your service. I realize we're in open session and much of the information on military space is classified, but I think it's necessary for us to talk in general terms about the threats to our space systems. We've enjoyed a distinct advantage for decades, but now that's being severely tested and challenged. So what actions have you taken to address this threat to our military space, our national security space assets in this budget? I'm sorry, it's a great issue. It's so much we cannot talk about in open session. But needless to say, we are advancing our capabilities in a number of different areas to make sure that we can fight in space, which has now become a warfighting domain. Obviously, we stood up Space Force. We've stood up Space Command. That'll give us enhanced authorities and control. We've requested additional authorities, which the President has granted. And so we are doing our very best and putting a lot of resources into this to make sure that we can continue to guarantee our space capabilities and what we need from space. Are you confident that the assets we are investing in this budget will stay ahead of and will meet the threat? Yes, I am. Okay, good. That's good to hear. Then let me shift attention to missile defense funding. Secretary Rood and General O'Shaughnessy have both said that while our current GMD, ground-based mid-course defense posture, can be relied upon to counter a North Korean threat for the next 5 or 6 years, beyond that, we have to begin assuming increased risk due to their desire to develop their ICBM capabilities. Earlier this month, General O'Shaughnessy said before SASC, given the nature of the ballistic missile threat, I am a strong advocate for bringing a layered capability on board for the warfighter well before NGI, Next Generation Interceptor, is fielded. And Secretary Rood agreed. So are you in support of an SM-32A underlay or some kind of interim GMD solution to bridge this gap until NGI comes online in a decade or so? Well, I think it's a matter of principle. We should always have a layered defense. I know the department is looking at those systems to include enhanced THAAD as a way to provide a layered defense. But in all circumstances, you want a layered defense. So testing the SM-32A would be one way to begin establishing that underlayer? SM-32A is a system that you'd have to continue testing to make sure we can do that. I have a recusal with regard to the company that makes that system or parts of it, so I don't want to say too much. It is an established program nonetheless. Okay, sure. Now, on the budget itself, the dollars you're asking for missile defense, when you subtract things out that historically have not been in the missile defense budget, like Air Force OPIR, you come up with a number that's about $14 billion. And the way I look at it, that's half $500 million less than last year's budget. How can we keep pace with the emerging threats if we're cutting that budget? Well, Congressman, when I look at missile defense and defeat, our numbers, we see actually a 5% increase. Important to that is a OPR layer in LEO. That'll give us critical tracking capabilities, sustainability, particularly with regard to enemy hypersonic weapons. It's a growth area where we really need to invest more with regard to that LEO OPIR. Okay. Thank you for that. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman. I yield back to balance my time.
Thank you. Mr. Garamendi.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for your service, but apparently you're not listening. You apparently were not listening to what the chairman and the ranking member said about the authority of this committee with regard to appropriations. I urge you to very carefully consider what has been said thus far with regard to the ripoff and with regard to the disregard that this administration has for the Constitution and the appropriation power of Congress. Secondly, in your response to Mr. Courtney, you were out of line, sir. The law is quite clear. When you submit your budget, you are to submit the shipbuilding plan. And for you to say you're going to give it to us on your own good time and when you're ready, you are not in line with the law. I'll let it go with that. You should listen very carefully. You are heading for a major brawl with this committee. Now, my question goes to you, Chairman Milley. The U.S. government's current approach to strategic sea lift has yielded an aging and inactive government fleet that depends on a shrinking pool of merchant mariners and ships that have trouble getting underway. I'm concerned that a resilient maritime logistics strategy doesn't exist, and that in your job as chairman, it seems to me that you're responsible for coordinating all of the necessary elements to achieve a resilient maritime logistics program. How are you going to achieve that?
Thanks, Congressman. I would even expand it beyond just the maritime. So the issue is for the United States to project power overseas at points of crisis, time of need sort of thing, and to do it in a timely way. Get there firstest with the mostest sort of thing. And we do that fundamentally through sea lift and airlift. And in both those areas, our strategic ability to do that has been under stress. It's deteriorated over not just last year or the year before, but many, many years. And you're right to point out the vulnerability of the maritime fleet and our reliance on other means to try to do this. We can handle the smaller contingencies, no problem. But if you start seriously considering great power competition, great power war, when you start seriously considering the NDS, well, those requirements then, and I think you heard the Transcom commander talk the other day or testify perhaps recently, then it becomes very much a stress. So what are we doing about it? There's lots of studies and analysis and so on and so forth. That's important, and we have to try to figure out exactly what the facts are. But it's all about investment. It's all about these budgets, and it's all about looking at tip fids and also concepts of the operation and O plans as to how we're going to have to modify with the deck of cards we're dealt. We're not going to magically create a new maritime fleet this year or next year, and yet something could happen. So how are we going to have to deal with that? And we have a review ongoing right now amongst the Joint Chiefs of all the global combatant commanders' plans, war plans, and I am the global integrator, as you rightly point out, and we're working through all that. It's a very, very difficult situation, and it is a vulnerability that we have. We recognize that we have it, and we're going to try to get it fixed.
Thank you, sir. That does take us back to what I just brought up with Secretary Esper, in that his shipbuilding plan doesn't speak to this issue at all. There are ways of doing it. There's an interesting report out there called Sustaining the Fight. It talks about the development of a national fleet, which is really the rebuilding of our maritime sector, the private commercial sector, in such a way that it is useful to the Navy for sea lift capacity. To draw your attention to that, look forward to working with you on this set of issues. And finally, Mr. Secretary, obey the law and recognize you're in for a major brawl with at least a good section of this committee as the President continues to rip off what were apparently necessary funds. You also indicated in your response on climate change that it is not affecting the Navy or not affecting the military. Perhaps I heard you wrong. You might look at Tyndall. You might look at Offutt. You might look at Norfolk. You might look across the entire spectrum of the military and recognize that there is a severe impact already as a result of climate change. It's going to get worse, and I urge you to pay attention to the current NDAA that requires you, as Secretary, to pay attention to this issue in every single part of the military. With that, I yield back.
Well, Mr. Garamendi, I am paying attention. As I said very clearly to Mr. Langevin, I do recognize the impact on the military. In fact, I mentioned Norfolk in particular, and I mentioned the impact of desertification on Army bases.
Yeah, and where is it in the budget?
The gentleman's time has expired. I get the feeling this could go on for a while, so I'll get to Mr. Whitman. Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Esper, General Milley, thank you so much for joining us. Secretary Esper, I wanted to ask you specifically about sea lift. You heard a little bit of the question, but I want to go to September 17th when there was a turbo activation of our surge sea lift capacity, essentially trying to exercise what would be a full-scale operational exercise if the call went out that day. Our readiness goal there is 85% availability is what we're supposed to have. Unfortunately, under that exercise, we saw that our availability was at about 40%. We know we have an aging ready reserve fleet, on average 45 years old. Those ships are older than a number of members on this committee. So we are really pushing the envelope with that. The question not only becomes what do we need to do to reestablish that. I think that some of that's laid out, although I think more needs to be done. But one of the important elements is, how do we pay for that? You stated that of the strategic necessities for our nation, the B-21 was the responsibility of the Air Force. The Columbia class was the responsibility of the Navy. Since surge sea lift capacity is the ability for the Army to get to the fight, should it not be the Army's responsibility to fund surge sea lift capacity?
Well, first of all, I completely agree with you on the sea lift issue. I've been concerned about it for a few years now. General Lyons and I have had multiple conversations. As you know, 90% of the Army goes by sea, which is why once I get the 30-year shipbuilding report and I have a chance to go through it, I want to make sure sea lift is in there because we have to have that capacity. And it's a combination of new ships, old ships, and other means to do that. So it is vitally important. I have, with regard to your specific question, I have not looked at that with regard to who should pay that. It's traditionally been a Navy bill. Each of the services pays bills that they argue should not be theirs. The Air Force, for example, doesn't like the pass-through with regard to a lot of black programs. Army has concerns on its front. So I think at the end of the day, what we have to do is find a solution going forward so that we can fund the Navy we need, and that includes not just surface combatants, but that includes the strategic sea lift.
Yeah, I think the logistical element of supporting forces, sustaining forces is going to be key, especially in that strategic environment where all our adversaries have to do is to look at it and go, listen, they can't sustain operations, they can't protect tankers, all those things incredibly important to those O plans that General Milley spoke about. Let me take another step further, too. You've heard some conversations about the 355-ship Navy. I think it's got to be there, and as you spoke of, maybe even higher as we look at all the different platforms. The key is, though, this year's budget. I mean, this year's budget request, as Mr. Courtney pointed out, 8 ships, 2 of those tugboats, and then we're decommissioning 4 LCSs, 4 cruisers, and 3 amphibious ships. So, I mean, I'm not very good at math, but that math doesn't add up to me to get to 355. In fact, we're heading south on that. So tell me, as we see our near-peer adversary, China, bring on board a brand new destroyer, a very capable ship, the Shandong class of aircraft carriers, is that really the direction that we need to be going? And is the budget reflective of what this nation needs to project power and to deter conflict?
We need to get on a better trajectory for 355 plus for sure. That's why, as I said earlier, we need that 3 to 5% annual real growth to help do that. I do support, though, the Navy's decision to reallocate dollars, if you will, to readiness because of the challenge they have with getting ships to sea and operationally available. I also understand the reason. In many cases, they're putting more money into maintenance for ships than what it would cost to fund them going forward. So, look, they're in a tough situation. I want to help the Navy as much as possible. Acting Secretary Milley's made I think a good call to dig deep within his own budget. I mean, about 10 or 11% of the entire Navy budget is only dedicated to shipbuilding. Right. And I think he's going to dig deep to try and find additional funding to do what he needs to do. And then what we like to do also, I think I mentioned this to you, is have a legislative provision come forward where DOD would seek authority to transfer any expired Navy funds, which otherwise would go to the Treasury, and have them plowed back into SCN. We think that could generate at least $1 billion a year or so that we could plunge back into shipbuilding. And that's something that other departments of the federal government already have available to them.
I agree. I think it's incredibly important to have flexibility in the SCN account, especially since the demand's going up. Dollars are either level or going down. Things like National Sea-Based Deterrence Fund. I understand the whole debate back and forth about the strategic assets in this nation's arsenal. But I think that discussion needs to be had because we did do Ohio class that way. And when you put a $6 billion ship into that shipbuilding budget, it makes the seas pretty tough.
Time has expired. Mr. Norcross.
Thank you. General Milley, Secretary Esper, thank you for coming in today. I want to shift my first question away from some of the things we've been talking about, but very much involved. Making sure warfighters get the best available to them comes from a number of areas. Our industrial base, who supports them, and then our human capital, the employees of the Department of Defense. Secretary Esper, on January 29th, President Trump authorized you to eliminate collective bargaining in the DOD and to delegate that authority to any Senate-confirmed official in the department. The President cited perceived threats to national security and the department's flexibility to adapt to new technologies as justification for this. DOD civilian workforce are some of the greatest employees in the world. We know what they do day in and day out. Ultimately, our national security is bolstered by those employees. We talked about that. Do you plan on exercising this authority to provide the President to exclude the defense civilians?
Well, first of all, Congressman, we do have a great DOD civilian workforce. In my multiple iterations to the Pentagon, I've had the chance to work with them. I am one of them. And it is a great workforce. We rely on them for the continuity and expertise that are critical to sustaining our military. You're right, that executive order was issued late January. It's working its way through the system right now. It has not come to me with any recommendations or analysis, and I know that's in the process, and that's all I have for you right now on it.
Did you request that or somebody on your behalf from the
No, I did not request that.
Do you have any idea why that came up?
I don't.
Can you point to a time in our recent history where that might be employed? Because I was going back through labor history, I didn't see any issues. I've never heard of it from anybody. But the folks that you want to be part of your team could be potentially eliminated because of this order that apparently came out of nowhere. And if you can't think of a reason why it might have been done in the past, and I don't know of any, how's this showing up?
Well, just because I can't recall an issue right now doesn't mean one doesn't exist. That's why I think the prudent thing for me is to wait to see what the analysis is, comes up from my staff, and what they're looking at, and make an assessment from there based on whatever recommendations are made.
So when you get that report, we would love to have that shared with us. The idea of creating potential havoc when we work well together, it just seems rather crazy. I only have a few minutes, but I just want to bring up something that has been alluded to. We have early retirements for the 13 KC-135s and 16 of the KC-10s. It's about 4 years ago that General McDew said in this very room, what keeps him up at night are the refuelers. We know the issues with the KC-46. There appears to be a gap that is growing here. Boeing, I believe you're very close to having the fix on both the boom and the visual system. But regardless of what the fix is, it's going to be a period of 3 years possibly. Why would we be retiring more refuelers when we're building up the capacity to need those?
Yeah, it's a great issue. It's one of these issues. It's not sexy, right? It's like strategic sea lift, but it's utterly important. I was on a 46 last week. I actually sat in the front end of the airplane where the issues with the remote vision system and talked through all the issues. And the head of Air Force acquisition thinks that a solution is in sight, but it will take some time. At the same time, I had this exact discussion about, well, what does that do to a growing gap, right? And I think General Lyons is going to come to me, probably the chairman, and make some recommendations as to maybe we should not retire some 10s or some 135s until we get a better assessment of how long it will take to get that fix in place. And I look forward to hearing from him on it because it is critical that we maintain that capability. This kind of also gets back into the reason why I'm doing COCOM reviews. We have COCOMs all the time. They're using tankers for various missions, and if they are missions that are not important or not on a high priority, I can close, in addition to increasing supply, I can reduce the demand.
Are you considering contracting tanker support from private industry?
I think all the options. I would like to rely on General Lyons to bring me a range of options that we can entertain and figure out what's the best way so that we don't have a gap that seriously impacts our national security. I don't know, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Ms. Hartzler.
Thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate your service. Clearly, we're at a great power competition with China, and we are assessing the threats. The National Defense Strategy lays out a lot of the concerns and strategies, but a vulnerability that we have is in our pharmaceutical industry. As we know, our national supply of antibiotics and vaccines and many other drugs depends on Chinese manufacturers. In fact, Chinese pharmaceutical producers provide 97% of our U.S. antibiotic market. So, General Milley, could you expound a little bit more on the vulnerability to our military as it relates to our dependence on Chinese for our pharmaceuticals?
Well, as you well know, we've got a military medical system, and we have access to all the same drugs that are available in the commercial system, et cetera. And you rightly point out that it's a vulnerability to have a country such as China manufacturing high percentages. I don't know if it's 97% or 98% or 80% or whatever it is, but I do know it's high percentages of the ingredients to the American pharmaceutical industry across the country, both military and civilian. So it is a vulnerability. If in time of armed conflict, if that were to ever happen, hopefully that would never happen, that would obviously be a significant vulnerability to the U.S. So it is something we need to address. We need to address it as a nation. There's vulnerabilities imposed on us as a military, but also as a society.
That's great. I appreciate that. Representative Garamendi and I have a bill that would ask the DOD to look further into this threat and to pursue standing up American pharmaceuticals in order to make that supply available for our military. So look forward to working with you on that. Secretary Esper, I wanted to talk about in 2019, Congress authorized the Defense Community Infrastructure Program, which to address deficiencies in community infrastructure that will enhance the military value and resilience, quality of life for military installation. And in the fiscal year 2020, Congress appropriated $50 million for this program that's to be managed and executed by the Office of Economic Adjustment. Yet to date, the department has yet to release guidelines or details about the process by which communities will be able to propose projects and compete for funding under this program. And I have communities in my district that are very excited about this program, and they're ready to apply. They just need that information, that guidance. So can you share a little update on when they can expect that guidance, and are you committed to this program?
Sure. Well, thank you for raising it, Congresswoman. I actually received several letters that I've reviewed recently, and I asked the team, what is this, what's going on? So I got a quick briefing on it. My understanding is they're going to be delivering, recommendations with regard to implementation here in the coming weeks, a month or so, and then from there we can move forward in terms of implementing the law and expending the appropriations as.
Good. Well, that's great. We also have challenges in our country right now with respect to the munition capability and capacity. As you know, our stockpiles of our high demand preferred and precision guided munitions have been significantly reduced over the last 15 years. We've been trying to address this, but I was wondering, Secretary Esper as well as General Milley, if you could talk a little bit about your assessment of where we stand right now with our precision guided and preferred munitions as far as the risk that we're facing right now, and what steps are you taking to adjust and counter this risk?
Another important issue that doesn't get much attention, it's something I get updated on regularly with regard to the status of munitions, particularly key munitions. There are some areas we need to continue to put a lot of money into. We did in this budget cycle. I've also messaged to many of our allies and partners that they need to procure their own key munitions. In many cases, they're depending on us, and I just told them that's not going to be available for them. So I think it's something we've got to focus on and continue to put money against. It's again, it's not sexy, but it's critically important we have availability of these assets and for an extended period of time, because in some cases, if you get in a shooting match, you just can't produce the munitions quick enough.
Exactly, and there's supply chain issues as well. What has been the reaction of your allies? As you have said, you need to step up.
I think this is one of these cases that for too long we haven't told them the truth with regard to what their expectations should be. And it's they've, by the way, for them to do that would not only make them more whole and take the burden off of us, it would also help our own industries remain healthy and be able to reinvest and recapitalize. So I think this is a message I've discussed with many of our allies about the need to procure their own precision munitions and other items.
Great. Thank you very much. Yield back.
Mr. Gallego.